afternoon, folks, and welcome to this week's episode of the Legal Beagle Podcast. This week, we are joined by a very, very important person, the president of the Arizona Association for Justice, Mr. John Osteen. Unfortunately, we had a technical mishap for the first half of this podcast. So we're going to jump right into kind of the middle of the podcast so you can hear from John directly as I ask him various questions about his practice in personal injury law, his acting role as president of the Arizona Association for Justice, and his thoughts on the future of personal injury practices for all attorneys. So without further ado, John Osteen.
This is a lesson that every trial lawyer knows, is that technology sometimes will fail you, and you always have to be prepared with a backup. So when we left off, we were talking about the importance of really getting to know our clients and embedding ourselves in their lives. And the case that I mentioned before with the young boy who was paralyzed and sustained a brain injury was a case that's really emblematic of how important that is. I spent so much time with that family that I became part of their family issues. And when there were things going on, I was brought in to try to help solve them and mediate them. And as a result of that, I really understood the intricacies of what they were going through and the challenges that they were facing as, a number of family members are working together to try to support this boy who needed just a ton of support. And it made me a better attorney when it came time to mediate the case and to sit down with the lawyers on the other side, because I was able to effectively communicate the story of what they were going through. And I couldn't have prepared myself for that just by reading his medical records and learning about what his particular issues were on a particular doctor's visit. I only would have been able to know that had I really been part of the family and had been living through the same things that they were going through. And obviously every case, it's not feasible to have that level of involvement. But our clients all have stories. And the only way we're going to be able to help them tell those stories is by getting to know them and understanding what they've gone through, and frankly, to have empathy for what they're going through.
So I imagine over your 15-year career as an attorney, you've made some mistakes. Tell me about one mistake that you just learned a lot from, because I think it's nice to talk about all of our wins and our successes. And I want people that watch this or listen to this to hear that, look, we're not perfect and there are mistakes made. Tell me about one that you have learned a great deal from.
Well, that's an interesting question. And I'm not sure I would necessarily characterize this as a mistake. But in this practice, trial opportunities are few and far in between. Trial attorney who averages one trial a year has a very active trial practice. So every time we're in the courtroom, it feels like we're shaking off some rust. I can tell you voir dire may be one of the most important parts of trial, but it's always a point where I'm most terrified because I'm in front of a bunch of people who don't know me and don't trust me. And I probably haven't been in a courtroom in a year in front of a jury. So it's always a little unsettling to get started. My wife is also an attorney, and she went straight to the prosecutor's office out of law school. As a result of that, she tried more cases in 2 years than I will ever try in my career. She's literally tried hundreds of cases. Dozens of jury trials. And I think that experience is invaluable, particularly for law students who are aiming to be injury attorneys. They shouldn't overlook a job that takes them outside of this practice area for a period of time. Consider working as a prosecutor or a public defender, because those trial experiences will be so valuable. I mean, in this practice, we're really judged on how we do in trial, and not just on an individual basis in terms of a particular client who we want to have a successful result for. But our reputations and our, professional accomplishments are built on what we do at trial. And if we don't have a lot of opportunities to get those trial experiences. So if I had an opportunity to do it all over, I think I would, I'd look really hard at having started in an area where I could get that trial practice right off the bat.
Sage words. John, do you love to win or hate to fail more?
I remember reading Andre Agassi's autobiography, Open, and if you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend it. But one thing that really struck out to me in that book was his statement that the losses stung far worse than the joy that he experienced from wins. And I imagine that feeling is shared among a lot of successful athletes, among a lot of successful professionals. But later in his career, Andre Agassi found a purpose to playing tennis. And for him, that purpose was using the financial resources that he attained through the game to support underprivileged children. And he opened up an educational academy where he took people who almost entirely came from families that had never put somebody into college. And I think one of the tremendous accomplishments was that the first graduating class of that academy, I think it was 99% of them went on to college. So, I mean, in this profession, the losses sting, and we never want to fail. For us, there will always be, the next case. If we don't do well, we dust ourselves off and we move on to the next file. But for our clients, it's their one and only case, and it's their only opportunity to right a wrong. So when we're not successful, I think we really have to learn from our failures. Did we make an error in case selection? Did facts come out during the course of discovery that really torpedoed the case? Do we retain an expert who maybe wasn't the best option? In this field, every case is a learning opportunity. But as Agassi did toward the end of his career, I've learned to enjoy the wins, not just for myself, but for the people that I'm helping.
Other than Agassi's book, what other books would you recommend that every trial attorney read?
My favorite book is Polarizing the Case, and I read that book before every trial. And I won't rehash the entire book because I think there's so many valuable lessons to learn as trial lawyers. But a lot of my strategy in trial is premised on the suggestions that they make in that book, and that there's really there are really two options in every case, two things for the jury to consider. One is that the plaintiff is a liar. And if the plaintiff is a liar, they should send him out with nothing, because our legal system isn't here to reward liars. If the person is not a liar, then that person is legitimately injured. And everything that the defense attorney has done to malign the character of that plaintiff is shameful. And the jury should appropriately punish the defendants for doing that. So, I really think that Polarizing the Case is a must read for anybody in this practice area.
Who do you admire in this profession? You can't say your dad, because your dad has done amazing work in our profession and a lot of good for all of us. But let's keep him out. Who else do you admire in our profession?
Besides you?
Besides me, yes.
I mean, if I had to, throw out a name or two, Jeff Trachtenberg would be probably at the top of my list. He has built a tremendously successful practice which in and of itself is challenging. But I look at what he has done generally for the community, and not just the trial lawyers community, but just Arizonans in general. And it's pretty inspiring what he has done to make this a better place, whether it be his work. And it was a hard-fought battle to raise the minimum limits of liability insurance in Arizona. And, many of your listeners will probably be aware that the minimum limits have been $15,000 for some time. What they may not know is that those limits have been $15,000 per person since 1972. And $15,000 bought you a lot more medical care in 1972 than it buys in 2020. But as a result of his efforts lobbying the legislature, he practically lived there for a couple years. Governor Ducey last year signed a bill that raised the minimum limits of insurance, and it's going to help a lot of people who are, injured in motor vehicle crashes, because you can go to the hospital and you can be in an emergency room for 4 hours, and you easily could have a $15,000 or $20,000 bill from that medical treatment. So I look at what he's been able to accomplish personally and his accomplishments for the greater good of this community, and it's pretty inspiring.
What do you tell people, or maybe a better way to ask that is, how do you respond to people when they call injury attorneys ambulance chasers?
I just laugh. I think people are quick to criticize attorneys until they need one. I've yet to have a client tell me that I'm an ambulance chaser, even though I suspect that, in 15 years, I've represented a lot of people with a lot of different opinions, politically, socially, and probably didn't have a particular like for attorneys. I represented a couple in a bad faith claim, and they were more sophisticated clients, and that they owned a business. It was a very successful business, and the husband told me right off the bat, I don't like lawyers, and I don't trust you, and it's going to take a lot for you to earn my trust. And that case, we litigated it for close to 2 years, took 20 some depositions. By the end of the case, not only had I, flipped their opinions on lawyers, but they invited me out to dinner afterwards. And I was actually out with my son about a week ago, and we were throwing football out on the first hole of the Biltmore golf course. We were over my in-laws' place and went out to enjoy the outdoors, and I saw them walking up, and I said hello, and it was like old friends. And so you have those people who are sort of critical. They think that maybe our motives aren't in the right place, but if you're doing good work and you're really getting to understand what your clients' needs are, you're going to earn their trust, and you're going to change their opinions of lawyers.
For sure. I started out this podcast introducing you as the current president of the Arizona Association for Justice. Can you tell me a little bit more about that organization, their mission, and your ascension to the role of president?
Well, yeah, I'll start in reverse order, because I wouldn't be the president this year had the previous vice president, Krista Carmen, not been appointed to the bench in Yavapai County. So I'm a little bitter about that, because I get to go through this presidency in the middle of a global pandemic and in an election year. So, I'm the guy people are, they're ducking when I call them, because they know I'm probably asking them for money. I've done that to you. And
Yes.
I do that to a lot of trial lawyers because, what this organization can accomplish requires a commitment from all of us. And, what we're out to do is preserve the right to a jury trial and ensure that people that are harmed by, wrongdoing of corporations, governments, have a civil justice system that is prepared and equipped to meet their needs. One of the things that I really appreciate about the civil justice system is it's the one area where, a person who doesn't have resources and, doesn't have an education, isn't well off, can stand toe to toe with the biggest of corporations. And that doesn't happen in our other branches of government. If you look, as we're going through a presidential campaign, the amount of money that is being spent to influence our opinions on various issues, to influence our opinions on political candidates is unprecedented. And this is the one area where those corporations can't flood a ton of money into the system and improperly influence the outcome of cases. Because at the end of the day, in Arizona, we're going to be judged by 8 jurors in our civil justice system. And I think that's one of the things that's really scary for corporations is that they don't have the control. They can't buy off a politician. They can't buy off a judge. They can't buy off the jury. So our organization, the Arizona Association for Justice, is really here to make sure that corporations don't try to dilute the right to a jury trial, whether it be forcing people into forced arbitration clauses, or taking away the right to jury trial in favor of a bench trial, or placing caps on damages. We put a lot of trust in our jurors, and this organization's here to make sure that organizations through politicians don't mess with that system.
Do you believe in the good of a jury? And what I mean by that is there are critics who say that juries are maybe not the best triers of fact for personal injury cases. There are critics who say that, juries don't know how to, or don't comprehend the injuries that people have suffered. There are critics that say that it's too risky, that you can get results that are just all over the map. Do you believe in the good of a jury?
Yeah, I think the juries can be a little more predictable than we give them credit for. And my experience with jurors is that they want to do the right thing. And we can all look to cases where we disagree with the jury. And maybe we justifiably disagree with the jury, or maybe we've read a biased story about the trial and we think, how could that jury have possibly reached that decision? But the reality is most jurors want to do the right thing. And this is the best system in the world in terms of seeking, redress for wrongdoings. So I have a lot of confidence in the juror system, and I would much rather, put my faith in 8 jurors than 1 judge, because, what you have is a greater diversity of opinion. If this legal system was decided entirely by attorneys, attorneys who represent the litigants, attorneys who have been appointed as judges to try matters, we're not far away from the other branches of government that we don't always have confidence in.
You talked earlier about some advice you may give a young attorney that wants to get into personal injury work. What are some mistakes, just a couple, that you see attorneys that have been practicing for a while either still making, or common mistakes that you see occurring in this profession that you'd love to see stop?
I think the biggest mistake that young attorneys will make from time to time is being somebody who they're not. we go to a lot of seminars that address trial skills. We watch a lot of videos from trial. We read a lot of books about trial. And the reality is, I'm not Jerry Spence. He might be the greatest trial lawyer in the world. But if I try to be Jerry Spence, I'm probably going to fail miserably at it. So my goal has always been to attend those seminars, to see what other attorneys are doing, to read the books, to watch videos, and come up with my own game plan for who I am as a trial lawyer and what I think will work for me. Because if I'm trying to be somebody I'm not, it's going to come off as forced. So when I go into trial, I just want to be myself. In terms of, preparing, for that, the ultimate end game, going to trial, I think the most important thing is practice. It's not the seminars, it's not reading the books, it's practice. And whether you get that practice because you start off in the criminal field and you're doing a bunch of bench trials, or you get your practice through compulsory arbitration cases, I think it's important to really hone your skills and understand what your personality is and embrace that when you go to trial.
When you ask a jury for a big verdict, you're asking them for multiple millions of dollars. Is that an awkward conversation for you? And if it's not, maybe a follow-up to that would be, how have you made it less awkward so that people who normally don't talk about money are comfortable talking about money as it relates to your client's injuries?
I think anytime you're asking somebody for money, it's an awkward situation. Whether you're young and you're asking your parents for some help, or you're the president of the Trial Lawyers Association, you're asking Jonathan Negretti for help, you're in front of a jury and you're asking for millions. It's an awkward situation. You have to be comfortable at it, though, because if you're nervous when you're asking for that money, a jury is going to recognize that, and they're going to attribute things to your nervousness that may not be legitimate. Oh, he's asking for too much money because he's nervous. So it is something that ultimately you have to be comfortable with. For lawyers who are listening to this podcast, I really rely on the damages instruction and try to use that as the basis of why I'm asking for that money, and that everything that we have shown you during the course of the trial is to show you the losses. It's not for sympathy, but it's for this point here where you're being asked to put money on those losses. And if you look at those jury instructions, we all think of an injury claim as being, medical expenses plus lost income plus some compensation for pain and suffering. And the problem that some lawyers get into, and I think is repeated by some jurors, is that they think of those damages in terms of some multiple. Okay, well, what are the medical expenses? We're going to multiply it by 3, and those are the damages. And I don't think that that's a fair or proper way to assess damages. So I think when you explain it to a jury that we're not here just for medical expenses, that it's a lot more than pain and suffering, and you use the jury instruction to get that point through, I think it's a lot more effective when you're now turning around and asking that person for millions of dollars. If you look at a jury instruction, the first element of damages isn't medical expenses. It's the nature, extent, and duration of the injury. The second element isn't medical expenses. It's pain, suffering, and anxiety experienced and reasonably probable to be experienced in the future as a result of the injury. You don't get to medical expenses until the third element of the jury instruction. So I always like to instill in clients that the medical expenses aren't why we're here. That's not the biggest loss in this case. And it makes sense if, you've got a friend or a family member who's involved in a crash. the first thing you ask them isn't, oh my gosh, what was the doctor's bill from your hospital visit? It's, how are you doing? What's in store for you? What are the doctors telling you about your injuries? What is your prognosis? Gosh, do you need any help around the house? Can I help you with dinner? Can I, pick up the kids from school? What can I do to help? And it's really those human elements of the damages that I think are most critical. And if you've done a good job in trial explaining to the jury what those losses are, then it's a whole lot easier to ask them to put a meaningful number on those damages.
How do you respond to the person who says, in a case where an injury has resolved, meaning you don't have lifelong care needed, and the criticism is, look, money's not going to make it any better. It was a mistake. It was an accident. It happened, but money's not going to fix it. How do you respond to that?
Boy, it's a good thing that jurors can't ask me questions. In Arizona, they can only ask questions of the witnesses. I think it's important to recognize that most losses as a result of injuries are not permanent. As humans, we are resilient people. And we want to get back on the horse. We want to get back to work. We want to get back to the activities that we enjoy. And so we work hard through recovery, following our doctor's advice to get to a position where we're much better off. And I think when jurors see that, and they see the determination of somebody who, they don't want to be somebody who has chronic, back pain, and they're going to do everything in their power to recover. And they're not going to use that as an excuse not to go to work. I think the case sort of sells itself at that point, and a juror can look at it and say, man, thankfully this person is not, critically injured and they're able to go about their life. But gosh, for that period of time, Jim was working, 12 hours a day and doing 2 hours of physical therapy 5 days a week so he could get to that point. And as a result of that, he sacrificed a lot. And they can look at that situation and say, I'm glad it's not a permanent injury, but it's something that was meaningful in Jim's life, and we need to recognize that.
I have a feeling Jim is a real person. That's just a guess. I don't know. I could be wrong.
I've got a feeling Jim.
Finish this sentence for me, John. The biggest challenge facing personal injury attorneys today is...
We're not supposed to criticize judges, so it gives me a little bit of heartburn to answer this question. But I think one of the struggles that we're going to face moving forward is a recent change to our ethical rules that will allow non-lawyers to own law firms. And the idea was sold to the public as being necessary to expand the availability of resources to underprivileged or underserved populations in Arizona, which I simply don't agree that allowing non-lawyers to own law firms is what's going to solve that. The reality is that the person who lives in Kingman and is living in a bad situation and has a potential claim against their landlord, those aren't the cases where hedge funds, corporations want to jump in and provide assistance to. There are just a few areas of law where I think hedge funds, corporations are going to become prevalent in this legal community, and personal injury practice is one of them. So this practice, one of the things that's always impressed me about it is that we're not competitors. Jonathan, you and I, we both run plaintiffs' personal injury practices. We both want to, sign up the big case and help the deserving person. And, a case that your firm signs up is somebody who I won't be helping. Somebody who my firm signs up is somebody you won't be helping. Although I say that with a caveat, because when I need help, when I've got questions, whether it be about an expert, about a defense attorney, about a particular legal issue in a case, I know that I can pick up the phone and I can get your help and your advice. In this practice, none of us see each other as competitors because we're all serving the same common good. And as a result of that, there's a certain camaraderie that we're all in this together and we're all going to help one another. And my concern is that when you turn over this practice to hedge funds and to large corporations, you're not going to have that type of camaraderie any longer. You're going to have corporations who are there to turn a profit and to expend the fewest resources and least amount of work necessary to get a quick result for a client instead of an outcome that makes sense for that client. So I guess my biggest concern going forward is how that's going to affect the personal injury practice. And Arizona is the only state that is allowing this to happen. So, we're a petri dish of sorts, and I see a lot of bad that can come out of this, and I don't see any good.
Speaking of petri dishes, there's a pilot program in Florida right now. They've actually completed their second jury trial, doing the entire thing remotely. I actually watched it because I was fascinated by this idea. What are your thoughts on the evolution of practice and trials, and whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea?
So I think in the short term, it's probably a good idea because in this practice, if you don't have a trial date, if you don't have that threat of getting in front of a jury, you don't have a lot of leverage to affect a resolution and to settle a case short of trial. So my concern when this pandemic hit was that cases were going to languish, that we weren't going to be able to impanel juries, that perhaps the legal industry wasn't going to respond to this crisis with technology that would allow us to manage as best we could. So I think that these trials have been very positive because they allow people who have very serious issues and need their day in court to be able to go on with their lives. It gives them an avenue to have that day in court. Long term, when we get past this pandemic, I'm not going to be clamoring for Zoom jury trials because I think that it's going to be a lot harder. I've got to give a lot of credit to those attorneys who have gone through a Zoom trial because it's hard enough to persuade a jury that your cause is right. But when you're adding all of the technological challenges of doing it all by Zoom and having 8 to 10 jurors log in and coordinating witnesses through technology that is really new is a challenge. And I hope we get back to trial because I think it's a lot easier for us as attorneys to connect with a jury and easier for our clients to connect with a jury, which is probably more important.
Well, I had the opportunity to do a compulsory arbitration completely virtual, or I guess remotely, and there were some challenges, but the technology worked. We were able to take witnesses. Everyone was respectful of the arbitrator. I was fascinated by the process, and for cases like that maybe are subject to compulsory arb, I like the idea of using that technology to get those cases done maybe quicker, maybe with less headache and less cost for either party. I thought it was fascinating. The trial, I don't know. If they offered it here, I would certainly sign up to do it because I think technology is amazing. And I think there are challenges. Look, we had challenges with this podcast and some of the technology that we're using, but I think it's interesting to see the practice evolve and to see what comes next. And I'm excited to see some of those things, and certainly want to be an early adopter of those things, because I think if you're not, you're still playing in an old ball field, and you're not willing to upgrade to the new ball field. So I don't know what that means for us and whether we'll see this thing roll out nationwide, but it's certainly an interesting idea. And I welcome the folks that are kind of behind this and pushing these ideas of using technologies. John, before I let you go, on a lighter note, the Pac-12 delayed the start of their football season. They're set to kick off in a couple weeks. Where do you see your Sun Devils finishing? Give me a prediction on a record and whether or not they're going to win the South in the Pac-12.
Man, I'd love to see 7-0. I think 5-2 is probably the most likely scenario, but this is a good team. It'll be interesting to see, though, how what's been a very unusual offseason translates into on-field performance. Because if you look at the SEC, I think there have been a lot of surprises there. Not a lot of defense being played, which normally we would associate the SEC with its strong defenses. But we're going to have a tough test right off the bat, starting off with USC. And if we can beat USC in game one, then I'm going to up my projection to 6-1 or 7-0. But one thing I am confident of is that we're going to finish a lot better than U of A, who I'm sure was disappointed when they learned that the Pac-12 would be playing a 2020 season after all.
I love it. I love it. I tell people I live on Pasadena. That's the Pasadena Avenue. And any U of A fan that I know or meet, I always, if they're going to come to the house, I always give them very specific instructions and directions on how to get here, because U of A has never been to the Rose Bowl. They don't know what Pasadena looks like. So even here in Arizona, I can imagine them getting lost. So I'm very careful on how to get them here, because it's very foreign. It's foreign territory for them. John, thank you so much for being on this week's podcast. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your insights. I appreciate the work that you're doing as the president of AAJ. And just you're an overall good human being, and you are certainly someone I admire in this profession. So it was very exciting for me to get you on this podcast. Thank you again. I appreciate the time.
You're too kind, Jonathan. Thanks.